Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. After the presentation, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now, I would like to turn the call over to Mr. Ed Shaza. Sir, you may begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon titled Bioenergy and Climate Policies and the Impact on Existing Forest Products Industries. My name is Ed Shaza, and I'm with the U.S. Forest Service Wood Education Resource Center. The webinar is being sponsored by us and Dovetail Partners, Inc., located in Minnesota. Our primary speaker today is Dr. Jim Boyer, who's the Director of the Responsible Materials Program with Dovetail Partners. Our plan this afternoon will be, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to the Forest Service's Wood Education Resource Center, and then turn it over to Dr. Boyer for the main presentation. Also on the line is Jill Johnson with the U.S. Forest Service, who has helped us put this webinar on today. As far as questions, what we would like to do is basically hold questions till the end of Dr. Boyer's presentation. However, if you see the Q&A button, you could send a question, and we may be able to direct an answer to it as soon as you send it. However, we really prefer to hold questions till the end. So if that's okay, we'll begin. Okay, I'm affiliated with the Forest Service Wood Education Resource Center, which is located in Princeton, West Virginia. And basically, the Forest Service has a center called WERC. Primary mission is to foster interaction and information exchange with the forest products industry located basically east of the Mississippi in the Eastern Hardwood region. And the whole goal of our mission is really to hopefully have a sustainable forest products industry that consistently employs people, provides products for all Americans to maintain our standard of living, and to do that in a sustainable fashion. Our primary focus working with industry is really to work with partners, be it industry, service providers, nonprofits, to really provide products that basically are useful or practical for the industry. A lot of the projects focused on short-term results, which you'll hear today. An example of one of the projects is what this webinar is all about, and really focus on innovation and problem solving based on input from industry. And the only way the Wood Education Resource Center really accomplishes anything is through partners with industry, with nonprofits, with service providers like Dovetail Partners. To service the area of the Eastern Hardwood region, basically we have a pretty small budget. And the last 5 years it's been shrinking. However, that still allows us to do some pretty neat projects. One of our key aspects of our program is an annual competitive grants program. And the program is basically focused on some key priorities, which are maintain the economic competitiveness of the industry, address the urgent issues dealing with emerald ash borer, other insect and pest diseases that may be breaking out in our country, and how can we address those from a utilization perspective, not only from just tree removal, but how can we offset the cost of the tree removals by determining markets and products from the material that's removed. And then lastly, in the most recent past, we've been focusing more and more on woody biomass and the sustainable use of wood for energy purposes. A couple examples of projects. During the last 6 years, we funded over 120 projects. A couple that may be of interest. National Network of Forest Practitioners. We worked with them. They developed a really neat web assistance program for small and medium-sized wood products businesses. So if you have a website, they can come in and help do an analysis in terms of number of hits, how to improve the number of hits to your website, and how to create a very effective and attractive website. Another really neat project is with the Architectural Woodwork Institute, and in particular, that association and several others have developed a Woodwork Career Alliance. And basically, the Woodwork Career Alliance is developing a set of national skill standards for various woodworking tools and equipment. And this basically will allow an employer as well as an employee to identify the skills an employer would want, and the employee would be able to show the skills that they have for a specific piece of equipment. It's a very interesting project. If you want to learn more about it, the website there, woodworkcareer.org, provides a wealth of information on that particular program. And briefly, every project that we have funded, the one that we're going to talk about today and all other projects, you can view a brief synopsis of each project on our website. And once the project is complete, there will be a final report, like the report for this project that we're going to hear about. This webcast will be included on our website. So if you're interested in learning what projects we have funded, like in the state of Mississippi, West Virginia, wherever, or on a key topic, ash utilization, biomass, marketing, internet, you could do a keyword search and find every grant agreement that we have funded, find a brief synopsis of what the project is about, and if the project is complete, find a final report, publication, a website, software that was developed from the project. And if you have any questions about the Wood Education Resource Center, please give me a ring or send me an email note. Okay, with that, let's get to the main event. And once again, just like to thank Dovetail Partners and their partners for the good work that they have completed on our topic today, bioenergy and climate policies and the impact on existing forest products industry. And our key speaker today is Dr. Jim Boyer with Dovetail Partners, and Dr. Boyer was a professor for many years at University of Minnesota in the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems. He's also the director currently of Responsible Materials Program with Dovetail Partners. And just a side note, here in my office I have a textbook that he put together as well as John Hagren, called Forest Products and Wood Science, published in 1982, a very good document. And hopefully some of you folks out there have a copy of that too. Okay, Dr. Boyer, it's all yours.
All right, Ed, and you're going to switch me to my slides, right?
There you go.
Okay. And Ed, I hope you have a newer version of that textbook because of the 5th edition that goes back to 2007. All right, well, hello, everybody. This is the topic we're going to explore a little bit today, climate and energy policy, the impacts on the forest sector, and what we want to talk about is how do you incentivize a new industry while at the same time protecting existing industries that rely on that biomass. Already been talked about, but this work was funded through a grant awarded by the Wood Education Resource Center, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Now, here's in detail what we're going to discuss in the next little while. We'll talk a little bit about what's driving this interest in biomass energy and a little bit of the politics of biomass energy. We'll talk about the potential for development. Then we'll kind of get to the meat of the matter, and that's potential impacts of energy and climate policy on established industries. And we'll look pretty carefully at that. Then we'll look at 5 scenarios that are built around various energy prices, actually built around the price of a barrel of oil. And then we'll get to talking about what are the problems that we see in current bioenergy policy and how these policies might be modified. to reduce impacts on established industries. So that's what we're going to do in the next little while. So just to start, just to talk for a second about this renewed interest on biomass energy. One of the things that stimulated interest in alternative energy in general is this whole business of the U.S. trade deficit and fears of insufficiency of supply going forward. This is a picture of the trade deficit in energy products that's led by petroleum. And you can see where we've been, a sharp drop in the last few years because of the Great Recession. But now things are coming back, and the current projection is for 2011 is that our deficit's going to be back up again in the range of 350 billion plus. So we're going to get back near record territory, it looks like, driven by the current high energy price. Biomass still makes up half of the renewable supply today, and renewables make up 8% of the total supply of energy for the country. So we're talking about a non-trivial enterprise here, and one that is poised to get significantly bigger going forward. If we look at what's going on globally, and now we'll focus not just on bioenergy but biofuels, you can see that there has been quite a bit of development. This slide goes back to 2008 with data to 2007 and then a projection to 2017. You can see quite an impressive development there. And at that point, early 2008, production of biofuels was increasing about 300,000 barrels a day. That's pretty impressive. Petroleum demand increasing by 900,000 barrels a day, so still outstripping the rate of bioenergy production, but nonetheless, pretty impressive development worldwide. Now we're going to focus today on energy. That's the topic of the seminar, and that's where we're going to focus remarks. But it's, I think, important to keep in mind that there's also a considerable amount of interest in biochemicals derived from biomass, and it's driven by the fact that I think we're all aware of the fact that there's a lot more comes out of a barrel of oil than gasoline. In fact, gasoline makes up a little more than half of a barrel. And you see all those other products there, lubricants, feedstocks for all the kinds of plastics we use for artificial fiber, different kinds of fabrics, asphalt, all those kinds of things. And if petroleum becomes near and dear, inordinately expensive, impossible to come by, we're going to need a source of those other materials. This is a projection by DOE going back to 1999, and they projected what percent of materials might come from, of industrial chemicals might come from biomass rather than petroleum going forward. And they indicated that today meaning around the year 2000, that was a very low number. They projected that would increase to around 10% by 2020 and as much as 50% by 2050. And that's a sizable enterprise. At that point, 2000, that $400 billion a year industry, if you hit even 10% of supply, would be twice the size of the forest products industry, the entire industry at that point in time. And just to wrap up this comments on biochemicals, if you look at what's out there, the kind of chemicals that are used for industrial feedstocks and things, and then current products, what you see on this graphic is everything that's kind of shown in gold. Those are products that are out there today and are routinely coming from biomass. We, of course, are about to move toward an era in which liquid fuels come from cellulosic pathways. But if we look at all these other chemicals, it turns out that most of these, there's been major technological development has occurred, and a lot of this technology is pretty much sitting on the shelf, and we're likely to see movement forward in all of these areas within the next couple of decades. All right, let's talk a little bit about the politics of biomass energy. And it's really, we're talking about the influence of policy here, so really we're focusing on politics and things that come out of the legislative system. And if we look at this whole area of biomass energy and so on, we find out that there has been quite a lot has happened at the federal level. And if you look down through these initiatives, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, the focus here is on ethanol production. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 focuses on biofuels and an expanded renewable fuel standard. The Farm Bill of 2008, quite a bit in there, aimed at incentivizing cellulosic biofuels. The American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, tremendous increase in funds aimed at pilot demonstration, integrated biorefineries, stuff like that. And then in 2009, the President provided a memorandum establishing a biofuels interagency working group, and the whole idea was to accelerate and increase biofuels production and so on. So quite a lot going on at the federal level, and we haven't really begun to touch on details, and I won't try to do that today because there's a great deal has happened. This is the Energy Information Agency's EIA of the Department of Energy view going forward of domestic liquids production, and you can see traditional sources generally trending down, but you see biofuels trending upward in their view. And this XDL, the blue part of that graphic, is the materials to liquids, so coal to liquids, gas to liquids. They see that increasing, but biofuels becoming more important in the future. Here's another expression of kind of the same thing of where they see renewable fuels going. Notice that in 2009, biomass is the blue part of that graphic, green is wind. Notice that biomass is maybe half of the quantity of wind. By the time we get to 2020, they're approaching equality. By 2030, as much biomass energy as wind, and then the same thing by 2035. So what EIA is projecting is considerable growth in renewables, and biomass is a significant part of that going forward. And then finally, on the federal, looking at federal initiatives, here's kind of where the funding has been to support and incentivize biofuels use. You can see some fairly significant funding going back to '97, a significant increase during the latter part of the Bush administration, and increases on through the Obama administration, some of which was really set in place by the Bush administration. And then the very large increase in kind of a blip of funding related to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So again, a lot of things going on. At the same time, the states are involved in this very much. And on this slide is a listing of the different kinds of initiatives you see within various states to incentivize bioenergy development and biofuels development. And it's gotten to be a fairly complicated thing and very difficult actually to keep track of, I think, for almost anybody. A guy named Dennis Becker at the University of Minnesota with a colleague, Lee, developed a tool for kind of tracking what's going on within the various states and trying to get a better handle on what is actually going on. Now, here's an example of the kinds of activity that's going on and how it rather overlaps. These two authors are actually European, kind of looking at the U.S. to see what's going on. In 2007, they give an example of one U.S. cellulosic ethanol plant and show the different kind of incentives that come to bear on this one plant. And you can see there grants from both the state and the federal government, exemption of sales tax on biomass for energy, a production tax credit for every liter of fuel that's formed, and then an import tariff to protect the domestic market, and then overriding all of that, a mandated use of cellulosic ethanol starting last year and going forward. So a lot of incentives there to make things happen. So now what we're going to kind of turn to is we're going to look at biomass potential and say, all right, this is all very interesting, but what is the impact on the industries that use biomass already? We could point to a number of things that have stimulated interest in the whole bioenergy movement, but there's probably no one report that stimulated more interest than what's known as the billion-ton report. This is Perlak and Company. And this is a kind of a summary slide as to what was judged to be potentially available in the way of biomass on an annual basis in the United States. Actually, the total projected was 1.3 billion tons by the time you bring into account biomass found within liquid waste streams and other kinds of things. You can see woody biomass here, 368 million tons projected. This is the same statistic shown in a little bit different way. And included in this, when you look at the assumptions upon which this report was based, and there's a whole bunch of them, so I've just pulled out a few of them with respect to forestry. No biomass will come from forested area not accessible by roads, so the roadless areas were taken out. Environmentally sensitive areas remain protected, so that was taken out. But also, currently utilized woody biomass is included in resource potential values. So that 368 million ton figure we saw included biomass that's already used by the industry, which turned out to be about 141 million tons. Quite a bit of that was already used. So what's happened since then is there have been some reevaluation of biomass potential. And here is one such study, just a graphic from a study by DOE. And if you look at this, the purple labeled silvicultural in 2017 and 2012, the top part of that graphic, that's what's projected to come from woody biomass. And the net effect is that the woody biomass projection that was in the billion-ton report has been revised downward from 368 million tons to 45 million tons. So the projection of what's actually available is only 12.2% of what it started out to be. But then, if you'll notice, by 2017, there's a projection that just in a 5-year period, the availability of woody biomass is going to grow from 45 million tons back up to 80, and that's going to come both from innovative ways, new ways of getting biomass out of the forest, and also from woody crop plantations. If we look at mill residues, which is where the main impact of demand has been so far in bioenergy development in the United States, and we look at residue supply and demand. I should have put circles on this, but if you look at the fifth column from the left, which is sawdust, shavings, and sander dust, that green column pretty near the middle, and then look over at the far right column called total there. We're going to look at those two columns. We go down shavings, sander dust, and sander dust. You'll notice about 20 million, 21 million tons a year. We come down to 2006, 22.2 million tons, 20.1 in 2007, and then a drastic fall off by 2009 down to 12.9 million tons. If we go to the total part over to the right-hand side, notice that total demand for pellets, medium density fiberboard, particleboard, pulp, stuff like that, those numbers are pretty constant, ranging from about 12 to 13 million tons, and that number didn't change very much through this projection period. So what it looks like is this: we've got a supply that has been on the decrease, and that decrease has come about because of the marked reduction in sawmill activity across the United States, but a demand for residues that has remained rather constant. So the gap between demand and supply has closed rather dramatically, and as you might suspect, that's had quite an influence on price. All right, so let's switch now to looking at potential impacts of energy and climate policy on established industries. And one thing we can say is, well, there's some general effects here that we can anticipate, those being that there is a potential here for impacts upon on global competitiveness. And when the U.S. government, when the federal government looks at this issue, that's the main concern, is what will be the effect on global competitiveness if energy prices are to rise significantly, or if climate policy were to, in effect, cause an increase in demand. And an example I can give us what what can happen here is there was a report in 2007 that kind of looked at what had happened during the period, the late 1990s up through 2006, and what happened was that energy prices increased significantly, and it's kind of hard to remember now, but as recently as 1999, oil was $19 and a few cents a barrel. As recently as 2003, it was $31 a barrel, $32 a barrel, but by 2006 had reached a level of $66 a barrel. And at the same time, within the United States and a focus on environment, companies were being actively encouraged to switch from natural gas to coal, or excuse me, to switch away from coal and toward natural gas and electric generation. And the result is that natural gas prices peaked, and the effects were fairly sobering. For example, the aluminum industry, which relies on electric power for 80% of its needs, was paying 41% more for electricity in 2004 than in 1997, and there was a major decline in activity within that industry. So one of the concerns here is that if things are done in the way of policy that have the effect of raising the price of energy, what could happen is that energy-intensive industries could simply shift operations to other regions, and they wouldn't even necessarily do that in any kind of an evil way. They would simply have to do that based on economics, and so we would just shift the impact someplace else and then lose massive numbers of jobs at the same time. All right, so let's switch to look at the forestry and wood products sector specifically. This is Department of Energy, 1998, looking at the potential of increasing bioenergy development. The challenge of broader implementation of biomass for energy is to gain the wider involvement of those entities most able to participate, as well as to stimulate new industry. So they're looking at this, how do we bring new industries into the whole bioenergy picture? And they said, although certain sectors of the forest products industry would indeed resist divesting more biomass resources for energy, then they went on to say that the fact of the matter is that for the most part the industry doesn't own the biomass that's out there, that in fact it's awarded to the highest bidder, and the last line on this slide says, therefore at sufficient price, energy interests could obtain additional biomass supplies. So their assessment was, well, the industry itself might object, but if the price is high enough, the biomass is going to go wherever. So they posed two questions. Will renewable energy mandates, if enacted, stimulate the birth of a new renewable-based generating industry? Or will the forest products industry overall be a formidable obstacle or a willing participant in additional biomass energy generation? And I think the answer to that second question is still a little bit of an open question at this point. This is a graphic that the World Resources Institute prepared, and they were talking in terms of both potential opportunities and potential risks to the industry of bioenergy development. And the way this slide is organized is to the upper right, you see positive financial impact, the arrow going up, increasing certainty, the arrow going to the right, the arrow going to the left, increasing uncertainty, and then the lower part of this is a negative financial impact. So let's go to the lower left, and what these folks said is that there's a significant risk and the size of risk is indicated by the size of the circles here. There's a significant risk in raw materials rising as a result of a focus on bioenergy. There is a smaller risk of land use competition, which could have an adverse effect on the industry. And then the biggest risk / opportunity of all is kind of in the center here, relates to forest productivity, and the question is, from a policy point of view and from a climate point of view, what's going to happen going forward? Will climate change cause a reduction in productivity? Will large numbers of large quantities of biomass have an impact on forest productivity from an adverse point of view, and so on? So you can see that there are potential risks here. There's also, to the lower right here, an energy price risk, which is viewed as pretty certain, and that is there's a risk of significant increases in energy, which could have both an adverse and a positive impact on the industry. I'll talk about the positive impact in just a second. Then you can see above the line, everything above the line is viewed as having a positive financial impact. The emergence of bioenergy markets, improvement in consumer, customer, government relations, improved product competitiveness, and stuff like that. We're going to talk about those things in just a few minutes. So here are the risks, impacts of rising energy prices, potential for raw materials price increases, increasing land use competition, and then this whole business of risk of loss of productivity. On the positive side, these analysts saw potential for equal chance for increases in forest productivity, potential for increased growth rates in a carbon-rich atmosphere, the emergence of bioenergy markets, increased competitiveness of wood products within fossil fuel and energy-intensive products. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. And opportunities in carbon markets and so on. The impact of fossil fuel price increases, there's a positive aspect to that, in that if you're competing with a more energy-intensive industry, which almost every industry that's competing with wood products is more energy-intensive, then the impact of those increased costs will be greater on those industries than on the wood industry. Now I'm going to spend just a brief amount of time on this graphic, but if you look to the left column, the second column from the left, you see the price of petroleum there, and this is what various scenarios we're going to examine are based on. You can see $50, $75, $100, $125, $150 a barrel, projections on up to $300 a barrel. And then what you see for various products going across the top, fuel oil, propane, natural gas, electricity, and so on, is what they should be worth if you take the BTU value of petroleum and you look at its current price, or you look at various prices, and then figure out what the value per BTU is, then that is used as a benchmark to figure out what these other materials should be worth in an equivalent price. And if the market were perfect, if you could perfectly interchange these fuels for each other, you'd have a very good alignment, but of course you can't perfectly interchange them. We're going to focus on two price levels, $100 a barrel and $150 a barrel. So we see, if you see the red arrows down at the bottom, the last line here is the February-April 2011 price level for these various products. So the upward arrow means that the current price is higher than what $100 a barrel would indicate. The yellow line, $100 a barrel, is where the price of oil is right now, for the most part. So we can see that some of these energy products are above what the equivalent price of oil would dictate. Some are below. Well, we extended that analysis then to begin to look at various kinds of wood products. And at $100 a barrel, wood pellets should be worth about $236 a ton. And if we look down to the bottom, the February-April price was about $249. So the price of pellets is pretty much in alignment with what you'd expect it to be given the price of pellets. Softwood chips should be worth about $105, and you can see down in the lowest line there, 60 to 160, 60 to 70. Those prices are not too far out of the line, but a little bit lower than you might expect. And finally, if we look at southern pine pulpwood, southern pine chip and saw chips, saw logs, and things like that, again, if we look at the yellow line, the $100 a barrel line, and we look at the equivalent BTU price for these various materials, you can see southern pine pulpwood, look at the very last line, 2913 is way below what an equivalent energy price would be at $100 a barrel. Southern pine chip and saw logs, $44 is well below $179 price that you might expect them to be, and so on. So if we again put the arrows on the graphic here, we see that the first two products here, southern pine pulpwood and southern pine chip and saw logs, are way below what their energy price would suggest that they maybe should be trading at. And one of the things I'd say here is that over any time horizon, over any long time horizon, the energy price and whatever price we have for any other use are going to come into alignment. Okay, just a few words about pulp and paper within the sector. This is a kind of a summary of a study that was done in Europe looking at a gap that was seen between supply and demand. So what you see, a little blue box right in the center of this graphic, 200 to 260 was viewed as a gap between what the industry is going to need and what was realistically thought to be available. And the study concluded that it kind of looked at three scenarios and said, all right, if there's no mismatch between demand and supply for wood biomass, then there'd be, in order to meet a 20% renewable energy standard, there'd be a limited effect on the pulp and paper industry. There'd be a cost involved of getting to this target of around $2 billion a year. A lot of the biomass would come from non-forest sources and so on. The second scenario is if there's a mismatch between demand and supply of biomass, given the current subsidy level and structure, then there'd be a significant increase in biomass, some risk to the paper industry, a significant risk of bioenergy not being fully produced. And then finally, a scenario in which the renewable energy standard would be enforced without actions taken to support the demand-supply gap. And in that case, what was seen was a large increase in wood costs, a large part of the European Union pulp and paper industry being non-competitive, and large costs of obtaining additional bioenergy supplies and large costs of providing incentives. Here's another study that's kind of interesting. This is a very recent study that comes out of the European Climate Foundation, and what they're looking at is the source of biomass to provide energy toward the renewable energy targets. And what comes out of this is they say that the graphic here, what's needed to happen is not happening. The authors say there are a few signs of the agriculture or forest industry starting to capture residues at a significantly larger scale. They point out that there's a lead time of 5 to 10 years, really, to make sure what is depicted on this graph in fact happens, and they call for urgent action. Some couple of interesting aspects of what you see here. One is, really in the big scheme of things, there's been a fairly modest increase in biomass demand within Europe over the last 4 years. On the one hand, you could say it's large, but in the big scheme of things, it hasn't been that large. But nonetheless, there's been a sharp upswing in wood costs. There's been a very sharp upswing in pellets. And And the net effect has been an increased competition for fiber with wood pulp manufacturers. Another interesting aspect of this graphic, and it shows in the upper right, the words right toward the double arrow at the top, is it says they will need imports from 120 pellet mills, each producing 500,000 tons per annum. And it's envisioned that those pellets are pretty much going to come out of, well, they'll come from everywhere. They'll come from the United States, Canada, and Russia primarily. A couple of things we might say about the paper industry. One is unintended consequences, and I would very quickly just give an example. The American Forest and Paper Association in 2005 did a study in which they concluded that a subsidy as little as 1.1 cent per kilowatt to encourage production of electricity was going to impact pulpwood prices in at least one state, South Carolina, and that implementation of subsidies of that level and just a little bit beyond would have undesirable impacts on the industry in 6 other states. And of course, we know that subsequently there was authorization of a 1.1 cent per kilowatt hour provision for electricity produced from open loop biomass and 2.2 cents for closed loop. A study out of the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech looked at the impact of imposing a renewable fuel standard in conjunction with a renewable portfolio standard. And what they found, what they concluded was that significant impacts of a renewable fuel standard and some kind of cap and trade implementation would be likely to divert significant quantities of biomass toward production of energy rather than paper, and an erosion of international markets for paper. A similar analysis of imposition of a renewable electricity standard, which the president, for example, in his 2008 election campaign talked about a shift to 25% renewable energy. Findings indicate that a shift toward renewable energy, if there wasn't a parallel program to increase biomass supply, would increase the price of biomass for electricity production by about 160%, an impact that would drop to about 67% if there were a parallel action to increase biomass supply. Now, I'm talking a lot about problems, and I don't want to give the impression that there are just problems out there. Most people looking at this have said that there is potential for significant energy efficiency gains in the paper industry, potential savings of as much as 25% by 2020 and perhaps more than that going forward. But they also say that it's going to be important for the industry to pursue those energy gains at a faster pace than they normally would be to meet the coming future. And then, of course, there's an opportunity in mills converting to fully functioning biorefineries to take advantage not only of the potential to produce energy from biomass, but also biochemicals to provide flexibility and an opportunity to be more competitive in markets. Let's switch now to look at the building materials side of the industry, in other words, the non-pulp and paper side of the industry. And we'll start out by just saying that in a world in which carbon and energy is constrained, or are constrained, this industry should be pretty well positioned. We hear all the time, we know that wood is a relatively low energy intensive material. Here is delivered energy intensity. Now, this is 2002 numbers, but this comes out of an EPA report 2007. So I couldn't find newer numbers that I could hang my hat on. But anyway, energy consumption per dollar value of shipments, you can see, is far lower than for the other industries here. When you look at the wood products line, second from the bottom. This is for delivered energy. So if you added biomass energy that is generated internally, then this number of 4.2 would be higher, perhaps as much as 2 to 2.5 times higher. But nonetheless, the wood products industry is well positioned with respect to energy. If we look at emissions intensities, we find the same thing, that CO2 equivalent emissions from the forest products industry is lower than for any competing industry, and by a long way. So if we get to the cap and trade environment or a carbon tax, the forest products industry would appear to be pretty well positioned. This is a key graphic out of a study coming out of Sweden, 2007. And it's a pretty interesting study, and I think we can learn a lot about what might happen in the United States going forward if we start to look at carbon taxes and other kinds of things. The first, in each category, steel, concrete, plasterboard, particle board, and lumber, the first bar there shows zero energy tax. So it just reflects the cost of energy that was in place in Sweden in 2007, which of course would be higher than here. And what you notice going across is the cost of energy for various industries. Lumber is very low compared to everybody else. Particle board, wood products industry is being relatively energy intense. There's a fairly high cost there, and here it's material production, energy, and emissions as a percent of finished raw material cost. So the next bar is what if you impose an industrial tax rate, again, that was in place in Sweden in 2007, and impose that industrial tax rate on energy. So you can see the effect there going across. Again, a very low effect on lumber, a relatively high impact on concrete. The next line is what if you impose a residential tax rate, which just as in the U.S. is quite a bit higher than the industrial rate. And then the last two bars, the white and the black in each category, that is furthest to the right, indicates a uniform carbon tax, which is described as a low tax and a high tax. And this is a tax level of 78 euros for carbon per ton, per metric ton. So that's a pretty good tax rate. That's equivalent to what, about $110, $115 in the U.S. on a ton of carbon. Anyway, if you look at the effects going forward, you see very large impacts on the steel industry, on the concrete industry, very low impacts on the lumber industry, relatively high impacts on an industry like particle board, which is kind of an indicator for composite industries. But even though the relative impact there is relatively high, it's a lot lower than for those other industries. So we can say, and we could talk a lot more about that, but we can say, as we did just a minute ago, that the industry should be pretty well positioned in a carbon-constrained world, but we have to say, what happens if to an industry whose principal raw materials can also be used in producing energy? And that kind of opens a new wrinkle into things, and it's a question that really was not addressed in the Swedish study that I just showed you. And you began to get an answer by looking again at European figures. Here's 1995 to 2003 wood cost history, and you can see where the graph starts really trending upward is in late 2002. Well, it turns out that 2001 is when Europe adopted the directive heading toward mandated use of renewable energy. And from that point forward, we've seen there has been a dramatic rise in the price of wood within the European Union. And we can use the particle board industry as a case in point. A 400% increase in the raw material prices for particle board 2002 to 2007 as a direct result. A number of analysts have looked at this to try to figure out why this happened. As a direct result of the renewable energy initiatives within Europe. In North America, we're a little bit behind Europe in that we haven't we haven't really focused on bioenergy for as long a period of time. We certainly haven't had the mandates that have been in place there. But nonetheless, we've seen a 40 to 100% price increase in North America by that same point in time. And then the recession comes into play, and it's hard to tell what's going on in the last few years. It all gets kind of confounded. And then, in the middle of all that, in the United States, along came the Biomass Crop Assistance Program. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this, of course, was the program that was intended to initiate new sources of supply for biomass, to bring more biomass onto the market, and so on. And I'm going to interrupt for a minute and change phones because I see I've got a low battery, so hold on just a second. Okay. But what happened was, out of $200 million initially spent, people who have looked at this recently have determined that about two-thirds of the initial spending was directed to current biomass supply instead of new supply. And in the short run, what the effect on the particle board industry was, the prices doubled as a result of this initiative alone. And then, because of the rising price of energy, the same industry experienced about 170 to 200% increase in the cost of resin, which is one of the primary costs in particle board production. So this industry has really been whipsawed, the particle board industry in particular. Now what's shown here is, this is life cycle analysis data for particle board, medium density fiberboard, oriented strand board, and then softwood plywood produced in the Pacific Northwest and in the Southeast. And it shows a number of things, but what I would direct you to is the last three lines across the bottom of this graphic. And those last three lines are total energy input, the amount of wood that's in the product per cubic meter, and the carbon that is emitted per cubic meter of production. And so let's take total energy input and just run your eyes across that last line, and notice that the total energy required in producing particle board, MDF, and OSB is a great deal higher than what is needed in producing plywood in the Pacific Northwest and in the Southeast. Notice that the amount of wood in the product, these first three products all have higher density than the wood from which they're made, so it's not surprising you'd see more in the way of wood input. So we see wood input is higher than what is the case generally for plywood. And then if you look down on the bottom, the amount of carbon, this is CO2e, carbon equivalent emitted in the course of manufacture. And you can see those numbers going across. And notice that in general, these values are considerably higher than for plywood. And what these numbers tell me is that if we move to an environment where the cost of energy starts to go up sharply, or if we have some kind of a regulatory environment in which the price of energy increases because we're going to tax carbon or whatever shape that might take, we could see advantage shift back to the plywood industry. The OSB industry over the last 15 years has taken a phenomenal amount of market share away from plywood, but we could see a shift back if we see an increase in the price of energy. If we look at the same kind of thing for lumber production, hardwood lumber, softwood lumber production, something I guess we all knew, but it's interesting to look at the numbers. Here's a study that shows that the amount of energy required to produce hardwood and softwood lumber on a cubic meter basis and a 1,000 board foot basis, both electrical and thermal energy. And I guess it comes as no surprise that it takes a great deal more energy to produce hardwoods and softwoods, primarily because of the drying step that's involved. So these two industries are not in competition with each other, but nonetheless, the effect of an increased energy environment, carbon tax environment is likely to have far greater impact on the hardwood industry than on the softwood industry. Some interesting studies that have been done, Omar Espinoza and his team at Virginia Tech have really, I think through another WERC study actually, looked at energy production, at energy consumption in the hardwood industry, and you know, they noted a very high energy consumption associated with drying and so on. They also noted that that energy costs in hardwood mills, energy expenditures as a percent of total cost rose 58% in the 5-year period leading up to last year. They went on to look to see what the industry was doing about it, and they found that I think only 1 or 2 mills out of quite a number surveyed had even done an energy audit. Most enterprises didn't have someone who was charged with tracking energy consumption. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting kind of picture. The industry is already being affected by rising energy prices, and probably is right at the point where something will have to be done to address these issues. We've already looked at these graphics, and I'll simply call your attention to the OPCO line here, the $150 a barrel line. And again, if you compare to the numbers at the bottom of the slide, we see that some of the wood raw materials that are out there are in fact at a far lower price than the current price of energy, and as the price of energy goes up, we're going to see impacts. One thing I'd call your attention to here, it's kind of been a accepted thing that as the price of bioenergy rises, there's likely to be impacts on industries like the particleboard industry, but there certainly won't be any kind of an increase, kind of an impact on the sawmill industry. Well, if you look at southern pine chip and saw logs, the middle column, you can see that that's not quite true. Those raw material supplies are going to be under significant assault from energy enterprises going forward very shortly. But it's kind of interesting to note that even if you go over to the saw log line, hardwood saw logs in the last line, there are some of the lower grade logs in non-preferred species that even today the equivalent energy prices are beginning to bump up against prevailing price. So it's going to be interesting going forward to see what happens there. Just a note about the logging sector. Quite a number of studies, especially those that look at the paper industry, kind of gloss over the logging sector and say things like, well, it looks like the logging sector will come out of this okay because, after all, there's a diverse set of industries that are looking for biomass from the forests, and so they will have a diversified set of clients and kind of be guaranteed a job and won't face the cyclical nature of that has typified the industry for a long time. However, if you take another look at this, over the last 15 years, logging costs across North America, including Canada, have risen somewhere around 50 to 67% for small to middle-sized firms, and the logging sector doesn't have the possibility of switching fuel other industries might do. So I think this industry is going to have to be quite aware of what's going on and really pay attention to opportunities for increasing energy efficiency at points they can. And in that regard, Forentech, FE Innovations, former Forentech, has put out a very nice document with a whole number of suggestions how the logging industry might proceed to increase energy. Now what we're going to do is look at some scenarios. We're going to look quickly at 5 scenarios based on kind of the information we've seen. And those scenarios are based around kind of 2 parts. One is energy price. We're going to look at $50, $75, $100, and $150 per barrel for oil. And you can see that $150 barrel price is certainly not impossible, because $147.80, I think, was recorded on July 3rd, 2008. The $100 price is the current price, and then, of course, 50 and 75 have been in the very recent past. And then these scenarios involve 2 options. One is with no climate policy, the other being some kind of carbon trading program, carbon taxation program in place. And again, looking at 5 scenarios, so we'll look very quickly at what they look like. Here's the first scenario. Petroleum is $50 a barrel. In this scenario, we assume it remains there, suggests relative long-term abundance. We assume that there is pretty much no interest in climate policy in the U.S., but the EU maintains its focus on carbon emissions reduction. We assume the economy will recover through a steady recovery. And because there's not interest in climate policy on the part of the population or elected leaders, we see carbon taxes and caps on emissions off the federal agenda, but we also see the state and regional initiatives that are now underway will probably continue. And within those regions, there could be local competitiveness issues depending upon the impact of carbon and so forth on policy. If the price of petroleum goes to $50 a barrel and stays there, that would lead to apparent energy supply certainty and a lack of commitment to addressing climate issues and diminishes interest in bioenergy. So eroded support for development of alternatives to fossil fuels. There's continued export markets because of the interest in Europe, but not very much demand internally with this stable energy and relatively low energy price. And furthermore, because the economy continues to improve, increased production of sawdust and shavings takes a little bit of pressure off of that price increases in that market. And by the way, you see in the upper right there's a green light here, and what that means is that green light pretty much means the industry can keep doing what it's doing now. Reduced focus on biofuels and bioenergy and low interest in carbon mitigation leads to less interest in bioenergy crops, so that takes pressure off the land. We had earlier talked about increased land pressure as one possibility of bioenergy development. And if the price of energy falls to about half of what it is now, the steel, aluminum, concrete, and plastic industries become more competitive with wood. Go to scenario number 2, and we'll now look at a medium petroleum price, no climate policy. The caution light is out now. Petroleum's at $75 a barrel, fluctuating in a $10 to $15 range and above and below that. So we got relatively high petroleum prices, instability. So there would be interest in development of petroleum alternatives, just as there is today, interest in biofuels, but because this scenario says we don't have a climate policy, we're not concerned about that, so there'll be some other effects. We assume that the EU maintains a focus on carbon reductions. So we've got interest in biofuels. Carbon taxes remain off the agenda, but interest in alternatives to fossil fuels other than transportation is likely to wane, as does support for related programs. And I guess all I'd say here is that we're going to see, under this scenario, we'll see upward pressure on raw material prices, biomass raw material prices for pulp and paper, particleboard, medium density fiberboard, and certainly the landscape, mulch, and bedding industries are going to see some pressure. Again, increased production of sawdust and shavings helps take some pressure off the market. As I pointed out a little while ago, we see some instances at this price where the value of wood as energy is higher than some current prices for raw materials, even in some markets that are producing saw timber. And again, at this $75 level, we see the competing industries to solid wood products becoming more competitive as the price of energy falls. We go to scenario number 3, which is the same as 2, except now we assume domestic support for carbon management is in place. So we see global pressure to act to reduce carbon emissions begins to influence U.S. policymakers to take action, and these local initiatives kind of help overcome inertia at the federal level. Now the red light is on because we see things happening whereby industry, the forest products industry, is going to have to pay attention and change what they're doing. EU maintains a focus on reduction of carbon emissions. Export markets for mill residues remain strong, but we see internal, domestic pursuit of energy production from biomass, major emphasis on biofuels production. So we see the present array of alternative energy policies and incentives persist, perhaps expanded, strong upward pressure on wood raw material prices. Sawmills and planing mills, for the most part, will benefit from all this because they will see increased prices for their residues, unless they happen to be part of the industry that's relying on low-grade logs, and they could see a bump in the price of those. They might have to raise the price they pay for those to keep them from going to energy markets. In some cases, that increase might be substantial. At this price level and under these conditions, and with carbon management in place, there's a strong incentive in all industries to improve energy efficiency. Operating costs for energy-intensive companies, industries goes up, and the cement industry is particularly impacted within this scenario because of the release of CO2 from reduction of calcium carbonate to lime. And then at this point, competitive balance shifts back toward lower intensity products and industries, which means the wood products industry would benefit here. Energy-intensive industries will be challenged to adapt to a new reality, and that would include paper and, to some extent, composite products. They're probably going to have to pay a lot of attention to energy efficiency, more than they do now. And then just a caution that whatever the United States does has to be done with an eye on what the Chinese and others do, or else there will be a major international competitiveness problem from institution of carbon policy. Now let's go to number 4. The red light is still on, and now we're up to $100 a barrel, which means we're only talking about the current situation. $100 a barrel with world events feeding supply uncertainty concerns. We're assuming in this scenario that climate issues are on the table, and so now we've got a very high energy price and climate driving government policy. And if you look at the 4th bullet down here, another thing that happens at this point is that the price of petroleum is high enough that unsubsidized production and transportation biofuels becomes economically feasible. So we don't even need a subsidy anymore to produce biofuels. They can pretty much carry their own weight. So we see cellulosic biofuels moving from pilot to commercialization, substantial demand for biofuels. And at this price, we begin to see private sector commercialization of many alternative energy technologies. There's a lot of things out there that are sort of halfway on the shelf. We're going to see those start coming in if we sustain price at this level. Energy from algae, Kior, basically bio-oil, GMO energy crops. We think all of those are going to become part of the energy equation. They become attractive without incentives. We see sunsetting of government incentives and subsidies. Energy values of all residues, pulpwood in some markets, small diameter logs become higher priced because of their energy value, and that includes some low-grade hardwood saw logs. The lumber industry continues to enjoy competitive advantage over more energy-intensive industries and fossil fuel-intensive industries. At this point, somewhere in here, there's going to be increased motivation for sawmills to use more of their own residues for heat and power generation, which in turn means that mills that rely on those residues, such as composite panel manufacturers and pulp companies and so forth, could face bigger problems. This is scenario 4B. It's really the same thing we talked about except without climate policy, and really the outcomes we see are pretty much the same except for the fact that if you don't have climate policy, then coal comes back into the picture when under climate policy pretty much is off the table and puts a higher pressure on biomass. And finally, scenario 5, $150 a barrel and higher. Pretty much all of the same factors that we saw in the previous scenario, except on steroids. That's why we have two red lights at the top of the page here. So we've kind of reviewed what happens at the $150 level. I won't go through that again. We believe there will be considerable economic disruption for any entity or company that's not ready. And by the way, we don't think the United States is ready for this level of oil price, even though it could be right around the corner. Energy and fossil industries that cannot adapt quickly enough fade. Better positioned companies will thrive, or at least increase their market presence. Alternate energy technologies will accelerate. We'll see a lot of pressure on woody biomass at this level. And everyone, even companies that manufacture much of their own energy within the house, are going to have a lot of incentive to increase their energy efficiency, sell power where they can, and so on. There's a motivation at this price level for other industries to shift to biomass. And by the way, in Sweden, where they have very high energy prices, one of the industries that shifts strongly to biomass is the cement industry. So the advantage that the wood products industry has in using biomass energy kind of doesn't exist there, because the competitors are doing the same thing. We see tremendous pressure on composite products manufacturers, and especially the standard particle board manufacturing industry under this environment. We also think industries whose supply chains are designed based on just-in-time delivery may need to rethink what they're doing. So I'm going to take about 5 more minutes here in discussing the last two topics, and then we'll have time for questions. I see there are 2 questions on the Q&A board right now. If you have others, you might want to put those up there in the next few minutes so we can get. Current problem areas we see is in current bioenergy policy is a lack of policy focus. Right now, if you look at the stated objectives of our bioenergy policy, they are increased domestic energy security, enhancement of the environment and public health, job creation and enhanced economic development of the rural economy, and diverse markets for raw agricultural and forest products. That's a pretty wide range of objectives, and the latest wrinkle on this now is that the International Trade Administration is now actively promoting and assisting companies to export biomass energy, to actually not only to export biomass energy technology, but biomass itself for energy production. And you kind of have to ask yourself, well, is that maybe in direct conflict with the first objective here? It looks to us that the attempt to satisfy a number of interests may be undermining pursuit of a coherent energy strategy. We've talked about diversion of raw material from established value-added industries, and there are a number of things that need to be done to make sure that doesn't happen. We need to make sure that creation of biomass supply is keeping up with demand. So I gave the example of concerns within Europe around this issue, but we think that the same problem could well be developing in the United States, and that there's a great deal of promotion being done to create industries that use biomass. We see a whole lot less activity in the area of increasing supply. Adverse impacts on global competitiveness. So we talked about if the United States happens to take action unilaterally or in concert with Europe, and if we don't pay attention to what's going on in Asia, it's something we have to be careful of. And finally, this issue of lack of recognition of sustainability benefits of biomass. A number of authors have pointed out that we don't really, let's put it this way, the lack of policy to credit distinct sustainability of biomass or to require sustainable use of something like natural gas or other fossil resources makes the cost of biomass appear high, when in fact, relative number based on something that's really supported in an obtuse way, difference isn't as big as it might appear. So let's wind up in talking about things that companies might do or how we might modify policies reduce impacts on established industries. Ensure that government initiatives relative to biomass supply keep pace with efforts to encourage biomass consumption of energy. And there's a whole number of things that can be done here. Move towards certification of federal forests, remove restriction on eligibility under the federal renewable fuel standard of bioenergy products derived from biomass harvested on federal lands. Eliminate programs and provision that provide direct support or subsidies. So really what we're talking about here is a BCAP-like program, and we think that rather than direct support, as indicated above, there are other things that can be done. Might be just as effective but wouldn't create the problems. Assistance in formation of landowner cooperatives, establishment of concentration yards, and increasing awareness of opportunities for increased income and increased woodlot management, stuff like that. Ensure that incentives for establishment of large-scale bioenergy facilities are not, that says notes, are not provided without careful assessment of biomass availability. In regions where there's well-established competition for biomass, don't fund large-scale bioenergy projects. Focus instead on smaller-scale bioenergy development, district heating, stuff like that. And then reconsider bioenergy objectives and programs to eliminate conflicting goals. Develop a focus and then go with that. One thing we really see is there's considerable experience in the EU with bioenergy kinds of initiatives and impacts on industries, and we need to be paying more attention to that because there are a few more miles down the road than we are, and we can learn from them. This is a specific objective, and I didn't really talk about it on the way, but basically within the Waxman-Markley bill, there are provisions in draft language that would protect industries that are viewed as most at risk from increased carbon taxes and things like that. And there are a suite of remedies that are proposed. The problem is that they aren't using a small enough SIC, not a industry code, to determine what the impacts might be on specific sub-industries. And it has been proposed recently that if the Waxman-Markley bill or anything like it goes forward, there needs to be more of a focus, kind of a sharpening of the pencil to look more critically at industries that might be impacted. And I would certainly say the particleboard industry is one that needs. And then this whole business of crediting biomass with sustainability advantages. Recognize industries potentially facing not only increased energy costs but also increased competition for primary raw materials deserve particular attention, and again I'd call attention to particleboard, medium density fiberboard industries. And the last topic, and I think the last slide actually, is what industries themselves can do to take advantage of opportunities or address problems. I think every industry needs to keep abreast of policy discussions that might affect the industry. There's a lot going on and a lot to keep track of, but it's pretty important. Proactively assess risk, do energy audits, start working now to figure out what in the heck you can do to reduce your risk in a carbon-constrained and energy-constrained future. Aggressively seek to improve energy efficiency. Things like identifying energy manager, conducting energy audit, measure and track energy consumption by machine center, something that almost, well, certainly most of the smaller companies in the wood products industry are not doing this kind of thing. Take steps to understand the carbon footprint. If we move to a carbon-constrained environment, it's important to know what can you do to reduce that carbon footprint. What can you do proactively right now to reduce that footprint? And then for a good part of the industry, there's a need of a priority basis to find alternatives to fossil fuel-based alternatives. With that, I'm going to quit. I'll say before we go to questions, we still have two on the board here, that The report that goes along with this presentation is already up. It's on the Dovetail website. I think Ed may tell you in just a minute that it's on the WERC website as well. But let's go to questions.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Rosie?
Thank you. If you would like to ask an audio question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. You will be prompted to record your name. To withdraw your question, you may press *2. Once again, if you would like to ask an audio question, please press *1. One moment, please.
Okay, one question is, how can we get copies of your slides? Ed Cheza, are you there?
Yes. Yes, we can, Meg, if you send me your email address, we can forward those to you, as long as it's okay with Jim.
Ed, I can barely hear you. Maybe other people can hear you better.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I cannot, but maybe others can.
Can others hear me pretty well?
I can hear you, sir.
Okay.
The operator.
All right. Meg, we can email you the slides, and also the PowerPoint, or actually this webcast will be on the WERC website. Once it's posted, I can send everybody the link to it also.
I got you fine now, Ed. I had my phone on the wrong mode, but you're coming in fine.
Okay, very good.
Are there any other questions other than that one from anybody? And
we do have some audio recordings when you're ready.
Right. So, Ed, I don't have anything else. What do you need to do from here?
Okay, Rosie, did you say we had some questions via audio?
Yes.
All right.
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Our first question comes from Shannon Benz.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So my question is, it seems from listening to the presentation that there's a fundamental assumption that, it's not an assumption that I share, and that is that biomass, particularly biomass coming from trees, is carbon neutral. When you paint these scenarios and consider whether there's climate policy in the U.S. or not, there seems to be that assumption that the emissions, the carbon emissions from burning biomass will be seen as a better alternative than fossil fuels, when a lot of scientists are now speaking quite vocally about the fact that per unit of energy, there's more carbon emitted from burning biomass than burning coal. So I'm wondering if you can address that, and if I'm correct that that's an assumption you've made throughout your presentation.
Well, actually, it's not. But let me address you're referring to the Boston Globe headlines that came out following the Manamet report. They're actually
referring to the Manamet report and Canadian report and Finnish report. There's many reports beyond the Manamet report. That's just the one that received the most publicity here in the U.S.
Yeah, there are also many reports, and many recent ones, who have gone back and looked at this emissions versus coal and find that even if you credit wood with the full emissions and don't count wood as carbon neutral, you still don't come anywhere close to the carbon emissions of coal. But I think that's a discussion for another day. But what we do in this study is we do accept that wood is a renewable source of energy, and that even though carbon is emitted when wood is burned, as long as that wood is coming from a sustainably managed forest, which is to say, there are many definitions of sustainability, but let's just say as long as growth is equal to or exceeds removals, that carbon is restocked over an extended period, and that within a forest management unit or within the larger landscape level, you can produce bioenergy and maintain a stable carbon pool on a sustainable basis in producing this energy. And I think we can't go on with this, but I'll just mention one other thing, and that is Some of these studies that want to assume assume greater emissions in coal and other kinds of things make an implicit assumption that you can continue to increase the store of carbon on the land through forest growth, and don't assume anything about unscheduled loss through catastrophic events and that kind of thing. But anyway, so I guess the answer to your question is yes, we basically assume carbon neutrality of wood in these scenarios where we're talking about wood having a carbon advantage relative to other materials.
I guess we'll disagree on that point. I do want to point out I think that's a fatal assumption to many of the things you presented today. Okay, well.
Okay, Rosie, next question.
There are no further questions at this time.
Okay, well, if
I see one question has come up on the board here. It says, have we looked at the combination of demand from UK? From Meg, can you, I don't have the full question in front of me. Can you punch *1 and tell us what your question is?
We do have a few more questions. As a reminder, please press *1 to ask a question. Our next question comes from Beth Adams.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you define the words renewable and sustainable. I think these are difficult words to describe, and so much of what you've shared with us today have been based on those words, an understanding of those words, and I would just really like to know what you describe as sustainable and renewable.
Well, I guess we could have a long discussion about the word sustainable. There have been long chapters written about that one word, but fundamentally, I would use a definition that would say, can you keep doing this over a very long period of time, and in such a way as to maintain the productivity of the system that you're working with?
I wonder if what you've shared today is in conflict with the what I see on the website in terms of ecosystem services, which says healthy forest ecosystems are ecological life support systems. Forests provide a full suite of goods and services that are vital to human health and livelihood. When natural assets we call ecosystem services.
Well, I would say this, in all analyses that have been done, and in a couple of other projects that we're working on at the moment, the assumption that we're making is that biomass resources come from certified forests, come from forests that are responsibly managed and are managed for the long term, and that do take into account the full array of goods and services that we would expect from forests, which is recreation value, wildlife assets, biodiversity, and all of those other kinds of things. And of course, we could get into a long discussion about this, but we're not talking about the full array of services coming from any one acre, and that whole discussion about how you manage over a landscape level. But we are envisioning whatever might happen must be done on a sustainable basis, and the natural assets on the land and forest productivity must be preserved going forward. And that's why I think there is a great deal of concern and a lot of proactive action on the part of the forestry community in looking at this whole bioenergy picture to try to anticipate what problems might be going forward, based on a lot of concern that energy is somewhat of a juggernaut. Americans can't quite get enough of it, and so we want to make sure that the ducks are lined up before we see large-scale impacts in demand on the land for biomass, rather than trying to react later. Ed, are you there?
Yes. Beth, are you finished? Any other follow-up questions?
Well, I wanted to give other people a chance to say some things. I mean, you know, I think it's fine to talk about responsible forest management, but what monies are there out there today to do that? I don't see, at least where I live, that forests are being managed responsibly. You know, we set aside a very small amount of forest and reserve. We're clear cutting, cut and run type of operations. Nobody's looking. I mean, that's been the history of what we've seen. And you know, when I grew up, I thought, you know, in Minnesota, I was under the impression that the Forest Service protected forests. But now, I mean, the bulk of your discussion today has seemed to me a sales pitch for cutting and burning forests. And really, to tell you the truth, the proposals themselves talk about the amount of CO2 that's emitted per megawatt hour is 50% higher than the coal generation. So to say nothing of the other harmful and health hazardous emissions and greenhouse gases that many health-related organizations have, American Lung Association, the American Cancer Society, have spoken out against biomass. So to my way of thinking, it's end of story if we have health risks, which imply higher costs to health. So those things need to be factored in when we're talking about biomass as well, I believe. And
well, one thing we are talking about for sure here is we are talking about energy supply for a nation that uses a whole lot of energy. And the question here isn't whether the nation's going to use energy or not. The question isn't whether the United States is going to build structures or not. The question is where are we going to get that energy and what are we going to build those structures out of, and so on and so on. And so we can talk about any material in a vacuum, and we can say that production of those materials, extraction of raw materials, has an impact on the landscape. There's no question about that. But the realistic question here is, what is the relative impact of one raw material versus another, of one product versus another? So when we compare the impacts of an energy and climate policy, for example, on the building materials supply industry of the United States, it's very, very clear that, for example, building more buildings out of wood would have a lower overall environmental impact, a vastly lower set of emissions that impact human health and all kinds of other things than if we build more buildings out of concrete and steel and those kinds of things. Even if the steel is 100% recycled, we still have vastly higher environmental impacts of building buildings that way. When we look at energy, it's the same question. So I think it's always important to understand that consumption has a price, that there are impacts associated with consumption. But when we start figuring out from a public policy point of view, what should we do, then the question becomes, what are the relative impacts of various courses of action?
Okay, very good. Why don't we get back to the question that's on the screen, and I can read it to you, Jim.
All right.
Have looked at the combination of demand from UK and USA. That's a question. Currently, biomass electricity projects in UK are burning pellets from the US.
Well, not only is that true in the UK, Europe overall is massively taking biomass resources from the United States, mostly in the form of pellets, mostly but not totally. So Europe often is credited with having a very forward-looking energy and climate policy, and to some extent I think that's true. But on the other hand, they acknowledge that a good part of their strategy is to obtain the raw materials they need from some other place. So we have looked at the combination of demand from Europe going forward, and actually within our group we believe that what should happen in the United States is that we should seek to develop a local demand for pellets for district heating and other kinds of things, again within sustainable limits. I'll use the S word again, and try to keep those resources here at home rather than shipping them over the pond. The flip side of that is that Europe's energy policy is very much based on the prospect that they're going to continue to get those resources from North America and from Russia.
All right, thank you. Very good discussion on the questions. We're probably a little over time, but want to make sure that we answered or addressed all questions. Any other ones, Rosie?
Yes, sir. Our next question comes from Margaret Sheehan.
Yes, my question is, in 2006, Harvard's Index estimated that the U.S. could meet our national energy needs for only 1 year if every tree in this country were to be burned for biomass energy. What is your response to that?
Well, that's probably, let me think about that. It would be close to being true, I suppose. If we look at right now, biomass provides 4% of our total national energy supply right now. If we took everything that was being, so say is the question that we would simply go in and clear cut all of the forest and just whack the land dry and burn it, and that would supply for 1 year? Or is it a number that would look at the sustainable annual harvest? I suppose it wouldn't be. Well, I don't know how to answer that question except to say that wood certainly isn't going to come anywhere close to providing our nation's energy needs.
Thank you.
I guess one thing I would say about that is that you know, if we look at this whole business of forests going forward, and we want to have a nation that is abundantly forested as we can have, and we want to see those forests managed in a sustainable way, and we want to have forests for our kids and grandkids and all that kind of thing. A sizable portion of the forests in the United States are in private hands. About 57% of forests are in small private ownerships, and another percentage in industrial ownership and investment groups. Those forests need to have if you're a private forest landowner and you're maintaining a forest as a potential source of income, or at least a partial source of income, then there has to be continued demand for the products that come off the land, in this case woody biomass. And if there isn't, over any long period of time, what a landowner is going to do is, using a rational economic model, they're going to convert those forests to something else that does produce income. So one way to look at this, at biomass development, we've got to be awfully certain that biomass development, woody biomass demand, does not exceed the ability of the land to produce that biomass on a sustained basis, that does maintain healthy forests across the landscape. But we also need to take a look at the other side of the equation and look at the whole balance of products coming off the land and say, well, part of the equation that keeps forests as forests is to ensure that we have a continued source of markets for products that will come off that land.
Thank you. Next question.
There are no audio questions at this time.
Okay, how about just another 10 seconds or so in case someone else has a follow-up question.
And as a reminder, please press *1.
And while we're waiting, thanks again everyone for being on our webcast, our webinar today. Very good discussion dialogue afterwards. Thought it was very valuable. And if there's no other questions, Rosie?
No, sir, not at this time.
Okay, I think we'll conclude. Thanks again, and I hope you have a nice afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jim.